Good evening. I want to start by reading a couple of pages from an essay written by Padraig Pearse 102 years ago at Christmas 1915, a few months before the Easter Rising. There has been nothing more terrible in Irish history than the failure of the last generation. Other generations have failed in Ireland, but they have failed nobly, or, failing ignobly, some man among them has redeemed them from infamy by the splendour of his protests. But the failure of the last generation has been mean and shameful, and no man has arisen from it to say or do a splendid thing, in virtue of which it shall be forgiven. The whole episode is squalid. It will remain the one sickening chapter in a story which, gallant or sorrowful, has everywhere else some exaltation of pride. Is marrig dugni go hulk agus fies bocht in a year, says the Irish proverb. Woe to him that doeth evil and is poor after it. The men who have led Ireland for 25 years have done evil, and they are bankrupt. They are bankrupt in policy, bankrupt in credit, bankrupt now even in words. They have nothing to propose to Ireland, no way of wisdom, no counsel of courage. When they speak only untruth and blasphemy. Their utterances are no longer the utterances of men. They are the mumblings and the gibberings of lost souls. One finds himself wondering what sin these men have been guilty of that so great a shame should come upon them. Is it that they are punished with loss of manhood because in their youth they committed a crime against manhood? Does the ghost of Parnell haunt them to their damnation? Even had the men themselves been less base, their failure would have been inevitable. When one thinks over the matter for a little, one sees that they have built upon an untruth. They have conceived of nationality as a material thing, whereas it is a spiritual thing. They have made the same mistake that a man would make if he were to forget that he has an immortal soul. They have not recognized in their people the image and likeness of God. Hence, the nation to them is not all holy, a thing inviolate and inviolable, a thing that a man does not sell or dishonour on pain of eternal perdition. They have thought of nationality as a thing to be negotiated about as men negotiate about a tariff or about a trade route, rather as an immediate jewel than as an immediate jewel to be preserved at all peril, a thing so sacred that it may not be brought into the marketplaces at all, or spoken of where men traffic. He who builds on lies rears only lies. The untruth that nationality is corporeal, a thing defined by statutes and guaranteed by mutual interests, is at the base of the untruth that freedom, which is a condition of a hale nationality, is a status to be conceded rather than a glory to be achieved. And of the other untruth, that it can never be lawful in the interest of empire, in the interest of wealth, in the interest of quiet living, to forgo the right to freedom. The contrary is the truth. Freedom, being a spiritual necessity, transcends all corporeal necessities. And when freedom is being considered, interests should not be spoken of. Or, if the terms of the counting house be the ones that are best understood, let us put it that it is the highest interest of a nation to be free. They're the opening passages of Ghosts, this essay that Padraig Pearse, one of the essays he wrote in the 2 years before the Easter Rising, which really set out the nature of the project as he saw it, to be undertaken in that rising, the meaning of the revolution, that Ireland was a spiritual entity that needed to be reclaimed, that his people had been enslaved and needed to be freed, and that the people needed this freedom to be seen, to be announced, to be claimed, not to be conceded by those who had withheld it for so long. And that was the meaning of the rising. That is the meaning of why Pearse would repudiate immediately the idea that there was something to be said for hanging around waiting for the English to concede the freedom which the Irish people were begging for. that would have not satisfied him. He wished to take it because he believed that freedom can only be taken. This idea is among the many ideas which caused me many times to proclaim that the date the greatest tragedy occurred in the Irish nation was May the 3rd, 1916, the day that Padraig Pearse was executed. Because on that day we lost the vision of who we might be, the vision of what our nation might have been, might yet be, had we the people willing to understand what this man's vision was, truly was, rather than the caricature we have inherited of it, created by those who, for all the reasons that you will intuit between the lines of that passage, wanted to suppress all memory of Pearse as a great, great man, as a great patriot and a great intellectual and a great poet. If I were to read that passage maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago, I think certainly the first paragraph or two would cause people to sit up. This idea about the failure. But actually, as you read on, you realize that's a misapprehension. The failure of these people is not that they have failed us because they allowed the banks to go bankrupt, or they allowed our economy to go belly up, as it were. The failure is that they never understood in the first place what kind of a thing a nation is, what kind of an entity a people is, what it means to lead a people, what it means to lead a nation. And that's really at the heart of the questions that I think we are facing here tonight, and will be facing very fundamentally in the coming 6 months. If you look at the history that followed the execution of Padraig Pearse, from May the 3rd, 1916 to the present day, you see a pattern of degeneration, abysmal degeneration, from that high altitude that he set for us. A rough sketch of that history. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, as the world struggled to deal with the spillover of the wars, the First and Second World Wars, and to contain the consequences of those. Ireland stagnated, inevitably. Ireland had already been left in a perilous position by virtue of having attained its freedom at a time when there was virtually no support internationally for us as a nation. Unlike what happened, for example, bizarrely, a couple of decades later, after the end of the Second World War, where Germany, the nation which had virtually obliterated the Western world, was restored brick for brick by the rest of the Allies who had defeated Germany. To the extent that, and I think this is a bizarre recollection, that 10 years after the end of World War II, West Germany won the World Cup. Ireland has yet to win the World Cup. I don't necessarily make a connection, but you see my point. We were left to struggle. And yet we look back, we're encouraged to look back at this as a monumental failure of Irish leadership. There was no great failure in material terms. There was no material failure. Those men, De Valera and the others, did their best in those appalling years to rebuild Ireland. You might say they failed, but their failure was an honourable one, because they tried on the basis, more or less, that Pearse had outlined. But something happened around the middle part of the 20th century. The second half of the 20th century was a different picture. In the late 60s and 70s, there was a kind of boom in Ireland, the Lamass boom it's called, which it seems to me we look on as, a golden age, economically and to some extent culturally, in the sense that it was a time when in the rest of the world, the revolutions, the student revolutions of Europe had a certain echo here. They didn't happen here because we were somewhat remote, but the influence which they had its impact as the decades rolled on. And we ended up really
almost by stealth, been as influenced by those events as any other nation in Europe, and perhaps as we go forward, even more so. But the false promise of that 60s boom was quickly wiped out in the late 70s and 80s. And we returned to the kind of hopelessness that we'd felt perhaps in the 50s when we were hemorrhaging our population again at a rate not seen since the famines. And this sense of failure created a new kind of Ireland, a new thinking of Ireland, where there was a defeatism concerning the idea of Ireland's self-sufficiency, a defeatism concerning the idea that we had the possibility to make Ireland into a nation of our own making, by our own lights. And an entirely different kind of thinking came into play. And as a result of the different thinking, a different kind of leadership took over in Ireland. And the thinking was that we would become again essentially dependent on another outside power. That was essentially what happened. That having freed ourselves with the blood of Pearse and the others, we decided we would give ourselves back to the highest bidder. And that's what we did. The EU was the bidder that we chose. And on the 1st of January 1973, we handed ourselves over again to that entity. I remember that day very well because I was driving around with my father in the van, and it was a very funereal day for him because he had opposed it with every fibre of his being. But that process, which began then, inevitably created a new kind of leadership. Because in a process like that where you are dependent, the last thing you want is leaders of vision, leaders of intelligence, leaders of intellect, leaders who exercise reason, leaders who ask questions, who demand things of their people, of themselves, and of others who they deal with. Instead, you need essentially puppets. You need people who will simply act as messenger boys for those outside who will run the affairs of the nation which they have chosen to take over. I used to work in CIA when I was a young man, and I was a clerical officer, very exalted position in those days. In fact, it was in the pantheon of clerical officers, it was second only to being a clerk in the bank. I say this rather proudly. It was better than being a clerk in the post office. I'm sorry to say, you only needed an intercert for the post office, whereas you needed at least a pass leaving for the CIE. And I think you needed 2 honours for the bank. My wife will confirm that. She had 2 honours, I had none. But I have the honour of marrying a bank clerk, which is no small honour. But one of my ambitions when I was a clerical officer was to rise through the ranks, and there were different routes you could take. You could become an executive through the various layers of the clerical profession, or you might go and take a different fork and to become a station master. And in those days, to be a station master was a wonderful thing. Highly dignified role. You had a beautiful house in a railway style, which was a unique style, station house. And also you had a beautiful uniform, beautiful blue uniform. A little bit like garden superintendent's uniform, except better. More epaulets, more braid, and a flatter cap. And one of my great ambitions was to be a station master and to come out for the 12 o'clock train onto the platform and walk the length of the platform and salute the driver of the locomotive and walk back again. But sadly, this dream was snatched from my grasp because very shortly before I was due to ascend the ladder, they abolished station masters, more or less. And they replaced them with an entity called the hall keeper, which was a very tragic position. Because the hall keeper was simply a jumped up signalman. Now, signalmen were highly skilled people. In fact, they were more skilled than station masters, but you know what I mean. Like, we were clerical officers. And this was something to be. As John Lennon might have said, if he thought of it, a clerical officer is something to be. And the hall keeper was terrible come down from the station master, because he had a cap which was really no more than cloth. A floppy black thing, which kind of wore askew on his head, and the peak of it down over his eyes, and a ragged and bone uniform. All the dignity gone. So I lost all desire to be a station master. Or indeed, I never wanted to be a halt keeper. This is what has happened to our country. We're no longer a station, we're a halt. We don't any longer have a Taoiseach, we have a halt keeper who simply does the bidding of the clerical officers who operate on a high outside, telling him what to do. The idea that the Taoiseach now, I mean, it's a bizarre thing. When you see our Taoiseach, phoning over pop stars and movie stars and talking, when he goes into 10 Downing Street, the first thing that occurs to him is some rom-com movie, not Michael Collins sitting in this chair. When he meets the Prime Minister of Canada, they compare socks. And you would think, this is a terrible change. But actually, it's not a change at all. Nothing has changed. The office of Taoiseach remains as it was on the 31st of January 1972. Somewhere deep in the recesses of our imagination, that office still remains. But the person that claims this title now is not our chief. We don't have a chief anymore. We don't have a Taoiseach. We simply have a messenger boy. We have a hall keeper who does the bidding of outsiders. And that's where I want to come to, because the consequences of this are really quite dramatic. We've seen some of the consequences of this in the last few years, economically speaking, but that, to go back to Pearse, that's on the material plane. And of course it's important, but it cannot become preeminent, and it has been allowed to become preeminent, or was. In other words, the idea of our survival was put ahead of the idea of our prosperity as a nation, the nation of saints and scholars. What are we now? Where are those scholars now? Where are those saints now? Where are the monks? When I go abroad when I go to Italy or Germany or Spain, people often say, when are you going to send us some more monks? I say, please, have you got any monks to spare? We need them. We need your monks now. So, something has happened to our nation, which is not the Troika. The Troika is a symptom of it for sure. The loss of sovereignty is a symptom of it. The coloured socks is a symptom. But something has happened to our nation that we cannot understand. And you will not understand it because you will not hear these diagnoses any night of the week on RTE or on TV3. You will not read this diagnosis in the Irish Times or the Irish Independent or the Cork Examiner or any of these publications. This is the last thing they want you to think about, that something fundamental has changed. I want to talk a little bit, Kathy will talk more, I think, graphically about these things and more systematically in her analysis of this. But I just want to kind of go back briefly over the last few years, since, one of the consequences of the economic collapse was that we became once again vulnerable. Whatever sense of confidence and entitlement and dignity that we had achieved, spuriously I would say, as a result of a very spurious form of prosperity, but nevertheless whatever we had achieved disintegrated overnight, and we were reduced again to being beggars in Europe. Falsely, of course, because this was an artificial recession, or because it had been an artificial boom. There's an Italian politician called Beppe Grillo, who's actually a comedian, and he's very likely one of these days when you wake up to find that he is the Prime Minister of Italy. But I'm not a huge fan of his, apart from one thing he said, the most beautiful and perfect encapsulation of the problem of Europe now in the past 10 years. And he said that Europe suffers from a false lack of money. A false lack of money. This is exactly what it is. It's an engineered absence of money. In other words, they give it, they create it, and then they withhold it so as to starve nations in order, therefore, to pillage them again of the real wealth which they have. And this happened in Italy. Italy, I go around Italy speaking, and I say, you're one of the top 3 or 4 richest countries in the world in the things that matter. In history, culture, art, music, food, fashion, conversation, everything. And yet you're closing up your shops, your businesses, closing them down. Are you crazy? What's happened to you? You suffer from a false lack of money. We gave up our money as part of the deal with the European Union, and we lost not just our sovereignty, we lost our autonomy, we lost the capacity to be autonomous. But something worse happened, which is that in that state of vulnerability, we basically became amenable to every single demand that would be made upon us by those who claimed to be our benefactors. In other words, we could no longer refuse to do the things that we in the past might have regarded as non-negotiable, as deal breakers. And so in the last 5 or 6 years particularly, since the first shocks of the reverberations of the economic meltdown had died down and the Troika had come and gone and everything started to seem to go back to normal, things began to happen in our society that had never happened before and that we had never asked to happen. We never thought about. In 2015, we had a referendum on gay marriage. Nobody in Ireland had ever thought about this until maybe a few years before. Certainly nobody had spoken about it publicly. I often say that when I was growing up in Castlereagh, there was a couple of guys who were known to be gay, who used to hang around a certain pub in town, and everybody treated them with great respect. But I remember actually, if you were to go back there in 1977, December this time, 1977, and walk into Paddy Doherty's bar on Main Street, Castlereagh, and see those two guys sitting at the counter and say, lads, before long you guys will be able to get married to each other. They would have fallen off their stools in shock, and then they would have started laughing, and they would still be laughing at the idea of it. If you look back in the archives of the Irish Times or the Irish Independent, you might, listening to the rhetoric of these newspapers, of these journalists, you might imagine, well, in fairness to them, they have been campaigning for this fundamental human right for many, many years, many decades. And to give them their due, I don't agree with them perhaps, but nevertheless they have, and they won in the end. But you would be gravely mistaken to think that. Because in fact, if you went back to the archive of any of those newspapers, you would find no articles advocating gay marriage up to about 2012 or 13. No. You would find nothing on the RT website. This right came out of nowhere. The most fundamental human right of our generation, we were told. Came out of nowhere. Never heard of before. Suddenly popped out. And it's a very interesting way in which it popped out. The way suddenly politicians who had previously not just not talked about it, but had dismissed it out of hand, were suddenly waking up one day and saying, it is the most fundamental human right of our generation. It's almost like on a certain Tuesday, around about 2012 sometime, in the early part of 2012, all these people, journalists, politicians, went to sleep one night, and they had a dream. They all had the same dream. And in that dream, it was announced to them that gay marriage was the most fundamental human right of our generation. And they woke up thinking, oh, it's true. I must go forth from this place and announce this to the people. But they didn't really so much announce this as go out immediately and attack anybody who hadn't had the same dream on the same night. Most of the things they said, and this is true of all the articles you'll find in the Irish Times, for example, are not evocations of the beauty and the wisdom of gay marriage. They're attacks on people who haven't accepted the idea of gay marriage. So, this is an example of something that has been presented to us in one way, but which you can see in an entirely different way when you begin to look at it closely and think about it closely. The same is true of the referendum that took place in 2012, which seemed to be somewhat less controversial, but actually it ought not have been. That was a referendum ostensibly or allegedly to give rights to children. But children already had rights. And many of the rights they had, most of the rights they had, came to them through the trust of their parents, in the context of their families. And they had worked admirably for many, many decades, many, many generations. It's very interesting, in the course of that campaign, certain cases were used by those who were advocating, and most of those advocating were people with strong financial, economic vested interest in the outcome of the referendum, although these were almost invariably unannounced or were not emphasised. And the right was presented as a right of children, but if you have an 18-month-old child crawling around on the carpet, it's very unlikely that child will suddenly decide that I must go to the Supreme Court and exercise my rights. I'm going to instruct lawyers on a certain matter. They ask their mother or their father for a bottle of milk or a biscuit, and they get the bottle of milk or a biscuit. And that is the nature of their rights. And that's the way they are in the Constitution. But we were told that this was, again, an essential, suddenly, spontaneously had erupted, this sudden need. And in order to achieve the outcome that they desired, the advocates of this so-called right started to take up certain cases, which repeatedly, those of us who opposed it, had taken apart systematically and showed that what they were saying was false. Cases like the Kilkenny incest case, the Roscommon case, the Baby Ann case. Systematically, we showed the allegations being made in relation to these cases, to wit, that the Constitution had acted as a barrier to protecting children. In no instance was that found to be true, in no instance. And to this day, nobody has been able to produce a single piece of evidence that the Constitution acted as a barrier to the protection of children in any context. It was always, always system failure. And in some instances, in the Roscommon case, the system had actually refused to go to court to protect the children, for whatever reasons, which remains unclear. The result of all of these two referendums is that we now have two articles in our Constitution, probably two of the most fundamental articles in our Constitution, Article 41, previous Article 41, the previous Article 42, which respectively guaranteed the rights of parents and the rights of families. And they now have been essentially filleted and have had all of their powers insofar as they function to protect families, to protect the autonomy of families, the inviolability of families, and the nature of relationships in families, which is the biological relationship between parent and child, and the relationship between spouses. All this has been changed and rendered meaningless by those two referendums. Because in one case, we actually have now taken the threshold of state intervention in families down to basically the floor level. There is no threshold virtually. And in the case of marriage, we have redefined it away from biology. So biology has no function or meaning in the context of marriage now. The idea of the family as a natural and fundamental unit group of society is now effectively a satire on our society, on the nature of our society. Because if two men can be treated in the same way as a man and a woman who between them can beget a child, then obviously the complementary relationship between that man and the woman has no meaning, and the biological connection between the father and the child and the mother and the child can have no meaning, because a relationship which is incapable of begetting a family must be treated constitutionally and legally in exactly the same way. And this is the ultimate meaning of these two referendums. But this depredation will be as nothing compared to what we will face if in 6 months' time the Irish people have voted to remove Article 40.3.3 from the Constitution. Because if this happens, we will really have demoralised ourselves, literally, demoralized ourselves at the most fundamental and base level. We will have effectively destroyed the political life and capacity of our society, of our nation. Because what we're actually being asked to do is hold a plebiscite on the idea of whether it is okay to kill a certain category of human being. That's the question we're being asked. They can dress it up as they want, but effectively this is the question. There's something interesting to be said about this. In the first place, Kathy will elaborate on this, but just to make a sketch on this, there's something particular about these 3 articles. There are other articles that this is true of as well, but the rights in these other articles are not as crucial, and they don't actually impinge on the most intimate and precious realms of human life. But these 3 articles, Article 41, Article 42, and Article 40.3.3 at the most fundamental level, do have this quality. And that it is this, that if you look at the language of them, they used words like acknowledge. They don't claim that the Constitution extends these rights to people. They don't say the people of Ireland offer people the right to life. They don't say the people of Ireland offer people the right to the protection of their families. No, the Constitution acknowledges that these are antecedent, pre-existing rights, that they precede the Constitution, that they are eternal rights. They are, in the language of the Constitution, inalienable and imprescriptible, which means they cannot be given up and they cannot be taken away. Which raises an interesting question, by the way, and let's leave Article 40.3.3 because I don't want to even tempt fate by anticipating an outcome. But let us look at the possibility that in the future, say, I don't know, 50 years, if we can imagine the following scenario, that after all this terrible period of fools and hall keepers and people with colourful socks, we might one day have leading us, or leading our children or our children's children, a group of people of integrity and patriotism and wisdom and reason. And just supposing that they had appointed a Supreme Court which was comprised of the same kind, the same character of individuals, it is quite possible, I tell you, that that Supreme Court will revisit the referendums we held here in Ireland in 2012 and 2015 and conclude that both of those referendums were unconstitutional and therefore invalid. That they sought to perpetrate a sleight of hand by suggesting to the people that they had the right to decide whether a family could consist of a man, a woman and a child, or something else. Or that they could decide that it is okay for the state to cross the threshold of a family, an inviolate family, inviolable family, and dictate to that family how to rear its children. It is possible, but I won't hold my breath. But it is possible. And it is possible also, I'm tempting fate somewhat, regardless of the outcome of next year's referendum, it is possible that a mature, wise and reasonable Supreme Court might look at any damage that was done to Article 40.3.3 and restore it to its former, i.e. its present form, on the basis that any interference with it was unconstitutional and therefore invalid. I think that is possible, but I won't be holding my breath. But I say this to underline the point that what is actually going on is a confidence trick. We are being told that we have the right to vote on something which we have no right to vote on, which is it is an obscenity to ask us to vote upon. And we are told that the outcome of that will govern the future in relation to this issue, and therefore will have the potential to result in the destruction of human lives. This is unthinkable. No civilized society could possibly contemplate such a scenario. Can we imagine if we were to consider a possibility of a referendum on whether politicians might be allowed the right to life. I would oppose it. I assure you, I promise. I would oppose it with every fibre of my being. Well, maybe not quite every fibre of my being. But that's what we're being told. So there's a trick being played on us. And we need to become aware of what the nature of the trick. And Father Marcel will later on talk at a much deeper level about this. But I want to just simply introduce to you the idea that what we're actually being asked to do is have a plebiscite on whether it is okay to kill babies in the womb. You know, I say to people, would you take the knife to a baby in a womb? Would you pull a limb from a baby, drag it out of a womb? Well, if you wouldn't, you have no right and no business walking into a polling booth and putting a mark on a piece of paper which will have the same consequences many, 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 many times over. We need to speak very directly to people about this, because this picture has been really controlled. And this brings me to the I suppose, almost like the core point I would like to make, because of course it seems like the core point has to do with the right of people to live, and of course it ought to be that. But there's another point that is actually, in a certain sense now, more fundamental. The worst thing that has happened to this society, of all the things, and I've touched on some of them, is that we have been denied the right to speak. And this has happened by a process of osmosis, which gradually has crept up on us, and we haven't been aware. I notice it now all the time, where even in small groups or big groups, there's a certain reticence among people to even hazard an opinion until they get a sense of how the land lies. And they kind of giggle and laugh a bit. And maybe they'll express an opinion if they feel that it's safe. But then they might pull it back if somebody says something something interrogative or something hostile. In the individual, there's a paradox here. In the individual, necessarily, to speak well, to be a good conversationalist, as it were. I don't mean that in the Oscar Wilde sense. I just mean to be able to talk intelligently about things. You need to think a lot. That's essential. In a society, actually, ironically, it's the other way around. If you want to think well as a society, you need to have a very healthy conversation. And that's fundamentally what's happened here. And to explain to you why we could have arrived at a situation where adult people, even old people, women, men, people that you wouldn't harm a fly, can actually say the most appalling things on the basis of some pretext which they heard some so-called expert outline on prime time. Sober, sensible, reasonable people who wouldn't hurt a fly say, well, you know, I'm in favour of, you know, qualified abortion, you know, limited abortion. Let's talk about limited murder. The trick that's being played is that the child has been redefined in a very interesting way. First of all, it's been placed in a corner of the picture where there is darkness. The child is never seen in this or heard, except when people who speak, who are already being caricatured, pro-life people, is being already caricatured. So the point is, one question is all you need. Yes, but you're a Catholic, aren't you? Knowing smile. Move on. End of intervention. The other thing that's happened is that the child, people say, there's been a redefinition of the child in the womb as not really a human being. But actually that isn't even true. That is not what has happened universally, in Ireland, I mean. Because in the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, a pregnancy is a wondrous and amazing thing, a beautiful thing, from the very first moment it is known about. And that thing in there is known to be a being. And people ask, I wonder, is it a boy, is it a girl? And soon now you can tell, relatively soon. And you can have the little picture. I often think it was a great mistake that we didn't actually, a long time ago, introduce a new kind of passport for a baby, which would start at the day of conception, maybe approximately hazarded, with a photograph and a number, picture of the first ultrasound, and produce this at the airport for your child and see what the guards would make of it. But what's actually, the redefinition is more interesting, because what the redefinition is that in the tiny minority of cases where the woman decides that her pregnancy is not the most beautiful thing that ever happened to her, is not something that fills her with joy, is a problem of some kind. And this problem might be something economic or whatever. It could be something that could be fixed in all kinds of ways. Could be addressed in all kinds of ways. She could be supported in all kinds of ways. This is never allowed into the discussion anymore. But because she has decided to see this child in this way, the society, it seems, is leaning towards redefining that particular child as not a child immediately. So the question of the rights of this person entirely depend on the attitude of another person, who happens to be the child's mother, if that's what we can call her. This never happens in any other context. It's impossible to think that our rights could be defined by what somebody else thinks of us. People say, we don't like you. Does that mean that I don't have certain rights anymore? I don't have the right to life because people don't like me. There are names for this. We've had these experiences before. I talked earlier about the Second World War. This was the ethic, or anti-ethic, which defined the problem of the Second World War, the extermination of the Jews. Why is this different? And yet these arguments are being trotted out because they are being repeated. And we need to be very, very conscious of this. And this is something that we could have seen. You think, okay, I'm talking about the media. I used to be a journalist. I'm not anymore. I write for occasional articles for American magazines. I will never write for an Irish newspaper again. I wrote my last article on the 23rd of May, 2015, which is the day after the count of the gay marriage referendum. And I decided that day that never again would I allow the newsprint of an Irish newspaper to accept ink which I had put in order, because I regarded the media as having disgraced itself, as having become a participant in a political debate, as having been allowed itself to be used as an instrument of bullying, of blackmail, of lies, of intimidation, of demonization, in the most cowardly way. That it was no longer entitled to be called media or journalism or newspapers. That these words were really, either they never had any meaning, or we had to find new words to describe these kinds of newspapers, these kind of radio, TV stations, these kinds of people now who are writing in these and reporting, so-called, for these entities. So I ceased to be a journalist. And every day that I wake, I see new evidence to confirm that I was right in that decision. The other night, somebody drew to my attention a tweet from a well-known troublemaker, friendly kind of troublemaker, who was goading an Irish Times, I think, journalist, about the fact that his newspaper had no more than regurgitated the press release in relation of Amnesty International in relation to a story which had emerged that Amnesty had refused to hand back about 150,000 euros it had got from the George Soros Foundation to fight to the repeal, so-called, campaign. And the head of Amnesty International was quoted as saying that basically he didn't have any regard for the law, and therefore he didn't intend to obey it. And the journalist replied in quite kind of whining terms, anonymous terms, we don't know the person's name. I'm guessing, I have a few theories. And the reply was said essentially, oh, it's all very well for you, it's easy for you to be, slagging us off on Twitter, but it's not your career. Now think about that. I'm a journalist, and I can't do my job because I might lose my job. What's the point in being a journalist then? But they're the kind of journalists we have now. They do what they are told. Like our politicians, they're hall keepers or signalmen of this new dispensation. So we don't have a conversation. We can't speak among ourselves. We're afraid, we're intimidated. And every so often there's a show trial, just to remind us, as with Kevin Myers, who was fired before he got out of bed in the morning, without being asked for his side of anything. George Hook was removed from his position because he said something axiomatic and obvious, something any of us as parents would say. And even if we wouldn't, he was a presenter of a radio program whose job it was to couch sometimes extreme positions as in the manner perhaps that a prosecuting counsel might put a case in a courtroom. That's his job. But none of this means anything anymore, because anybody who dissents must be removed. And anybody who offers any possibility of articulating a counter-narrative must be banished. And yeah, I think, I allowed myself to be banished because I came to the conclusion that even when you are there, you become simply a token instrument, which in some way gives a gracing aspect to the tyranny. That they're able to say, well, you can't say we're liberal, can you, because we've got this idiot allowed to write every week. Just shows you how enlightened and liberal we are. This is the state our country is in. We can't have a conversation, and without a conversation there is no democracy. And this is supposed to be a republic in which the people are sovereign. Not just an ordinary democracy like the UK, where the Queen is sovereign. We are sovereign. We've forgotten that. That moment when, if you're being in a courtroom, not just we have forgotten it, but they have forgotten it also. In that moment, when you're in the courtroom waiting for the proceedings to start, and the judge hasn't yet arrived at the bench, and then the door at the back opens, and the tipstaff, or whatever he's called, walks out, and he says, "All rise." And this moment, there's a shuffling of the feet, and people sort of bow in the direction of the judge. And the judge goes like that, generally. This is the wrong way around. The judge should be bowing. The judge should bow to the people. They have forgotten this. We have forgotten this. And we have allowed them to forget it. We need to remember this. We are the people. We are sovereign. We rule our own country, so far. But already they are dismantling the beams on the floor underneath our feet. The Constitution. They're taking it apart piece by piece. This is their third move. But they have, as Kathy will tell you, many more plans. And she will explain this in great detail in a little while now. So, this is where we are. We are being bombarded with propaganda. Please pay after the referendum, I have to admit that I was very lazy in my thinking up to the last referendum. And, I went into debates thinking, well, if you have a good argument, you have a chance of winning. The ability to win depends on the quality of your argument. The chances of winning depend on that. And then I realised at the end, this is really folly. Because when they construct an emotive context in which stories of individuals who apparently or allegedly have been hard done by are preeminent in the narrative. And in that referendum, there were stories every day. Isn't it a strange thing that, between about January 2015 and May the 21st, terrible things seem to happen to gay people every day of the week. And then suddenly they stopped happening. Nothing happening to gay people now, it seems, of an adverse nature. Everything. But terrible things are happening several times a day then. You see, so I began to think about this word propaganda. Because the word we kind of bandy around. I think we need to focus in on this and realise that virtually everything we hear and see now in our media is propaganda. It is not news, it's not information. Even the weather. I was in Wexford last night and I had to go to Dublin quite early this morning. I was terrified because everybody was telling me, oh, look at the paper, look at the headlines, It's terrible. I sailed to Dublin faster than I'd ever done it before from Wexford. I came down to Cork today, not a bother. Fake news. So dishonest. So, emotion. This is what they tap into. They create emotional narratives. And in that situation, we hadn't a hope in hell. Because we were trying to make reasonable arguments. And the more you make a reasonable argument, and no matter how, and the better it is, against an emotional argument, the more you're losing, by definition. Because you seem to be the kind of legalistic person who doesn't understand emotion. So the more reasonable and good your argument is, the more terrible you become, the more demonic you're capable of being made into. This time is a bit different. This time, if we can't win this one, as it were, we have the best client we've ever had. The little baby, the defenseless, unprotected, innocent baby. If we can't win this, we should give up. Because what they're asking is that we will actually introduce, in effect, by plebiscite, into our constitution, the capacity to farm out to private individuals the right to execute the most defenseless, the most innocent, and the purest of us all. And they will ask us to vote in and put our names to that, and everything we are as citizens, and everything we are as human beings. Everything that is, as Pearse said, part of this spiritual corpus of Ireland. Well, after the last referendum, we were boasting around the world that we had been the first country in the world to vote in, by popular acclaim, the right of homosexuals to get married. That may be as it may. Will we be able to boast that we were the first country in the world to vote, by popular vote, for the execution of little babies? Is that what we have come to now? Is that what we will say to Padraig Pearse when we meet him at the pearly gates? That's what we made of your country. The country you died for. Thank you.